Behind a modest home in Monroe, Connecticut, sits a room filled with objects that most people would never believe could exist, and those who have seen them often wish they never had. The Warren Occult Museum is not a tourist attraction designed for thrills or a collection meant to entertain curious visitors on a Sunday afternoon. It is a vault of spiritual danger, a repository of items so deeply connected to darkness and malevolent energy that Ed and Lorraine Warren determined they could never be safely returned to their original owners and could never be destroyed without potentially releasing something far worse. For over 6 decades, from 1952 until Lorraine's death in 2019, the Warrens collected objects from more than 10,000 paranormal investigations, and the most dangerous of those objects ended up here, locked behind glass, blessed by priests, and watched over with a vigilance that never wavered. At the center of this collection, inside a case bearing a handwritten warning that reads, "Do not open under any circumstances," sits a seemingly innocent Raggedy Ann doll with button eyes and a calico dress. The object that would become known worldwide as Annabelle, the possessed doll that launched the Warrens into international recognition and proved to be only the beginning of a collection that would grow to house some of the most spiritually active objects ever documented. The museum was built directly onto the back of the Warren family home, a deliberate choice that allowed Ed and Lorraine to monitor the collection constantly and respond immediately if any spiritual activity manifested. Ed Warren, a demonologist who spent his life studying the hierarchies and behaviors of demonic entities, designed every aspect of the containment protocols himself. He based these protocols on principles from Catholic demonology, specifically the concept that objects used in occult rituals or objects that have housed demonic presence retain a form of spiritual access that can be reactivated under the right conditions. This was not superstition or folklore to Ed Warren. It was spiritual law, as real and immutable as the laws of physics, and ignoring it carried consequences that he had witnessed too many times to count. The museum was blessed regularly by Catholic priests who understood the nature of what they were dealing with. Holy water was applied to the cases. Prayers of protection were recited over the building. Visitors were required to listen to explicit warnings before entering, and they were told in no uncertain terms that mockery, disrespect, or physical contact with the cases could result in spiritual attachment or worse. The objects inside the museum came from every corner of the Warren investigative career, each one carrying its own history of trauma, ritual, or violence. A wooden satanic idol carved with symbols of blasphemy had been recovered from a location where black mass rituals were performed regularly. Staff members who checked the museum each morning reported that objects placed near the idol's case were frequently found moved or knocked over despite the case remaining locked throughout the night. A shadow doll, its features barely discernible in the dim museum lighting, was photographed by multiple visitors over the years, and in those photographs, the doll appeared in different positions within its case, even though no one had opened it. A church organ, its keys yellowed with age, had been removed from a home where family members reported hearing it play hymns in the middle of the night despite no one touching it. Witnesses claimed the music was not random but deliberate, as if someone with knowledge and intent was seated at the instrument. Mirrors covered with cloth lined one wall of the museum, each one collected from a different case, each one reported by visitors to show faces that were not reflections of anyone in the room. These were not vague shadows or tricks of light. People described seeing fully formed faces staring back at them, faces with expressions of rage or desperation or something else entirely, something that did not belong to anything human. Other objects were connected directly to violence and death. Knives used in ritual killings, their blades still bearing the stains that no amount of cleaning could remove. Binding cords from cases involving restraint and torture. Implements of ceremonial magic, carved with sigils and anointed with substances the Warrens refused to identify publicly. Lorraine Warren, a clairvoyant who could sense the spiritual residue attached to objects and locations, described the museum as a place where the energy was so thick it felt like walking through water. She said that every object in the collection radiated the emotions and intentions of the events that had surrounded it. Pain, hatred, fear, and in some cases, a kind of cold intelligence that seemed to watch and wait. Visitors to the museum frequently reported physical reactions upon entering. Nausea and dizziness were common. Some people experienced sudden emotional distress, bursting into tears or becoming irrationally angry without understanding why. Others reported feeling as though they were being watched or touched by unseen hands. In more extreme cases, visitors left the museum only to discover scratches or bruises on their bodies that had not been there before, marks that appeared in groups of 3, a phenomenon the Warrens associated with demonic mockery of the Holy Trinity. The museum itself was not a case that required investigation in the traditional sense. It was the culmination of every case the Warrens had ever worked. Each object represented a family in crisis, a home under siege, a life disrupted by forces that defied rational explanation. The Warrens did not collect these items as trophies or curiosities. They collected them because leaving them in the homes where they were found would have continued to endanger the people living there. Destroying them, Ed Warren believed, risked releasing the entities attached to them, allowing those entities to seek out new hosts or new locations. Containment was the only option, and so the museum grew year by year, case by case, object by object, until it became the most comprehensive archive of paranormally active items ever assembled by private investigators. The warnings given to museum visitors were not theatrical performances designed to heighten the experience. They were genuine attempts to prevent harm, and the consequences of ignoring those warnings were documented repeatedly. A young man visiting the museum mocked the Annabelle doll, laughing at the idea that a toy could be dangerous and tapping on the glass case despite being told not to. He left the museum that afternoon and died in a motorcycle crash hours later, his vehicle losing control on a straight road under clear conditions. Other visitors who touched cases they were explicitly told not to touch reported strings of accidents and misfortunes beginning immediately after their visit. Cars that had run perfectly for years suddenly developed mechanical failures. Relationships fell apart without explanation. Jobs were lost. Health declined. A skeptic who visited the museum specifically to disprove what he called Warren mythology deliberately taunted the Annabelle case, speaking to the doll in mocking tones and pressing his face close to the glass. On his drive home, his car broke down 4 separate times, and each time it happened in the exact same location on the highway, a stretch of road with no history of mechanical issues or breakdowns. A woman who pressed both hands flat against the Annabella case, ignoring the explicit instructions not to make physical contact, reported that she could not sleep for 3 weeks afterward. Every night she experienced the same nightmare. A figure with glowing red eyes standing at the foot of her bed, watching her, moving closer each time until she woke gasping and unable to breathe. Ed Warren explained these phenomena with a consistency that never wavered across decades of interviews and lectures. The objects in the museum were not props. They were not symbolic representations of evil. They were active spiritual hazards, and the glass cases and blessings that contained them were the only barriers between those objects and the people who came to see them. Respect for those barriers was not optional, it was survival. After Ed Warren's death in 2006, Lorraine continued to maintain the museum with the assistance of their son-in-law Tony Spira, who had worked alongside the Warrens for years and understood the protocols as thoroughly as they did. Lorraine conducted tour until her own health began to fail, explaining to each group of visitors the history and significance of the objects they were seeing, reminding them that the items in the room were not entertainment, but evidence of real suffering and real danger. When Lorraine Warren passed away in 2019, the future of the museum became a subject of intense discussion within the paranormal community. Tony Spira, as the inheritor of the Warren legacy and the director of the New England Society for Psychic Research that the Warrens founded in 1952, has continued to maintain the collection. The museum remains closed to regular public access, but is occasionally opened for private tour and film crews documenting the Warren legacy. Individual objects within the collection, particularly the Annabelle doll, have been featured in numerous documentaries and have inspired fictional adaptations that, according to those who knew the Warrens, barely scratched the surface of the true events. The Warren Occult Museum stands as the physical manifestation of two lives dedicated entirely to confronting what most of society chooses to ignore or dismiss. It is not a place designed to impress or frighten for the sake of entertainment. It is a statement of fact, a declaration that the objects contained within its walls are real, that they affected real people in documented ways, and that they are kept here behind blessed glass and under constant vigilance so they cannot affect anyone else. Lorraine Warren said near the end of her life that the museum was meant to be honest above all else, to communicate without exaggeration or embellishment that the darkness humanity fears in stories and legends is not fictional, and sometimes that darkness leaves behind physical objects that carry its presence forward through time. The Warren Occult Museum is the most complete paranormal archive ever assembled by two individuals, and it remains, even now, a place where the line between the material world and the spiritual realm is unsettlingly, undeniably thin. Hashtags number Ed and Lorraine Warren, number Warren Occult Museum, number Annabelle doll, number paranormal investigation, number haunted objects, number demonology case, number true horror story, number supernatural history, number possessed doll, number vanishing roads, number haunted museum, number Warren legacy, number real paranormal, number cursed objects, number dark history. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented paranormal case files. All events reference real investigations by Ed and Lorraine Warren.